Thank you for joining us this morning. Take it away.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. I think we're getting all used to this by now. This lovely grid we all get to look at. Um, First up, full disclaimer. I feel like I should say this at the outright. Um, because I am going to be unmuted for the remainder of the time, probably. You may hear some odd banshee screams, some weird. Yeah, let's just go with banshee screams. I do not own a banshee. I do, however, have a 4-year-old um, and an almost 1-year-old. And so the first thing that I like to do in these situations is ask for grace and patience in case I get interrupted, which is, it's okay. My 1-year-old, who actually he turns one um, on Saturday, he knew that I was going to be sharing with you all and presenting this morning, so he let me sleep in until around 7. That was amazing. Really appreciate it. So I feel like I'm a little refreshed for you this morning, which is not always a guarantee. Um, but I would like to talk to you a little bit about not just who Church World Service is and what we do, but more specifically, what the future looks like for the organization moving forward. There has been a lot of changes, even over the last few months, that it's hard to even kind of keep track of what all is going on in the world of um, immigration and refugee resettlement. Now, I will say that this is maybe my third month on the job here at CWS. I was previously, for 10 years, I worked in Salunga at a little outfit called Eastern Mennonite Missions. And so that sort of became my world for almost a decade. And so transitioning here, I get to hang out with Church of the Brethren folks, which I find to be very fun. Um, and so with all that said, when I started around late November, early December, I can remember um, people were trying to sort of let me know who different churches were that are big supporters of CWS's work, and E-Town Church of the Brethren was by far the one that was almost spoken first, almost immediately, in terms of churches that have been heavily active in the world of um, immigration and welcoming foreigners into our community, both in the past and in the present. Um, so all that to say that your reputation, I think, precedes you. So I'm a little intimidated that I'm the one coming into this sphere pretending to talk like an expert. Um, so we'll see how this goes. So what I first wanted to do was talk a little bit about um, the dynamics of immigration. Church World Service as a whole works in about 30 different, well, maybe about 40 different countries around the world in all kinds of ministries, whether that's disaster relief, economic development, and working primarily with the displaced. And those activities are done through our global office. And Church World Service is made up of dozens and dozens of different member denominations, which I believe Church of the Brethren is one. So it's a very strong ecumenical movement. Started after World War II to help with reconstructing Western Europe. And there was this acknowledgement, I think, on behalf of a variety of different denominations that what they felt like they couldn't do alone, they could do stronger together. And so they formed Church World Service out of that spirit and out of that calling. And so Church World Service Lancaster is an affiliate office with the broader organization. And our task is to work primarily with working with refugees, asylum seekers, and immigrants that are within the Lancaster community. So for 34 years, I believe the office began in 1987, which makes it 34 years old because that was the year I was born, and that's how old I am. And so since then, the mission has stayed the same in the sense that Church World Service Lancaster's mission is to essentially fulfill the calling that we believe has been bestowed upon us by our following of Jesus' example of welcoming the stranger and the foreigner. One of the things that I've learned over the years, primarily at my work at, Eastern Mennonite Missions for a decade, and then working here for a brief period. Is he okay? Okay, he's fine. Baby's fine. Just checking. One of the things that I have come to learn over the last number of years, primarily living in a place like Lancaster. So full disclosure, I am not from Lancaster by any stretch of the imagination. I did not grow up here. I was not born here. I grew up in one county over in Dauphin County, which is essentially a different planet, it feels sometimes. And so I find Lancaster County to be such a unique place. And I think sometimes it's even underappreciated by people who have lived here their whole lives, just how, I'll just say special I have found this place. And part of the reason why I believe it is special is because it has a legacy upon its, not only its founding, but its current DNA today around being a refuge for those who are fleeing both violence and persecution and oppression. That is within, and I hope I don't romanticize it too much, but even deep within the soil itself of what Lancaster County is. For the last 10 years, I have been steeped in the Mennonite tradition within Lancaster County. And so coming to learn about how a lot of those churches were founded, from Swiss German refugees, essentially, fleeing persecution, and finding a place that William Penn was, sort of allowed these exiles to live and to, plant homes and churches and communities. And it was not always perfect by any stretch of the imagination in terms of, interacting with communities that were already here. But suffice it to say that being that safe place of refuge is something that has always been part of who Lancaster is, whether that was, helping resettle refugees from Vietnam and Cambodia in the 1970s after the Vietnam War, whether it was being a sanctuary for people coming from Central America in the 1980s during various civil wars and genocides, to today, where Lancaster is recognized nationwide as being per capita one of the most welcoming places in the nation. And that's actually given Lancaster a lot of attention, I guess you could say, over the last number of years. Sometimes it's attention that we don't necessarily care for. I think we like to keep to ourselves, I've learned. And so, yeah, there's this, when you're sort of ingrained with the idea of being humble about who you are, it's kind of odd when the New York Times starts knocking on your door and asking you, what's going on here? Why are so many refugees being resettled here? Why are there so many immigrants being welcomed into this community? And so I wanted to go a little bit deeper into specifically what the work of Church World Service looks like today, because there has been a lot of changes. Sometimes it feels like a whirlwind of change in a very brief amount of time. And one of the things that I will sort of appeal to this group in some respects in how to keep that legacy of Lancaster alive, even in this new era that will hopefully be both post-pandemic possibly and into maybe the roaring 20s. I don't know, whatever we'll call it. Many of you may know, and I will try to do my best to be as diplomatic as humanly possible. But at the same time, I also do not want to skirt around the facts that are the current immigration system within the United States. The best way I can put it is very complicated. And so that is due to not just one person, not just one act or decree, but decades and decades of people trying to figure out the systems that would allow immigrants to come to the United States. And so there is, a lot of misconceptions around what those dynamics are, how things are different between, I think we typically get very charged emotionally when we talk about some of these issues, when you're talking about people who come into our communities that we would deem either legal or illegal. And what are the differences between the different pathways that it takes for someone to come? In my family situation, which I think is probably a similar situation for everyone here, when Martin and Rose Mashas came to the United States, I think in 1913, they literally got on a boat in southern Poland and came. They came into Ellis Island. One of the interesting things about how they were received by America was their last name was immediately changed. So the way that you see that my last name is spelled, there are no Mashases in Poland. And so the system between 1913, when my ancestors came, to today is very different. But I want to specifically talk about refugee resettlement. It doesn't escape me that I'm speaking to you in the midst of constant rotating headlines, even in the last 2 weeks, around some serious immigration issues, particularly at the southern border. I'm not going to talk about those things. It is, it's sort of two different mechanisms in which the world that we work. However, some of the government agencies that we contract with are the same. When you're talking about, Department of Homeland Security or Office of Refugee Resettlement or the State Department. So essentially, we as in CWS are contracted with a variety of people, and we are recognized by the United States government as being one out of 9 established resettlement agencies that the UN contracts with as well, which is so different, I think, than so many previous generations. I remember doing a lot of research about when, for example, the Mennonite Central Committee in Akron was formed back in 1920, and sort of welcoming Russian immigrants during their Civil War and post-World War I. There was no Office of Refugee Resettlement within the United States. There was no real mechanism, if you will. They just came, and for those of you who are somewhat familiar with the work of MCC, they were just able to bring folks over. But today, you have to be contracted with the United States government like we are. And we are one of 9 organizations that are contracted with the US government. Um, we are one of two resettlement agencies in the Lancaster community, the other being Bethany Christian Services, which primarily works in a lot of adoption services, nation and worldwide, but they are also working in refugee resettlement. And so the first thing, and I feel, and if I'm, preaching to the choir, I apologize. I feel like a lot of this, some of you maybe already know, but it sort of bears, repeating, the fact that when we're talking about refugees coming into the United States, it is a full, legal process in order for them to do so. Um, it is also one of the most um, complicated systems for an immigrant to navigate, I think. Um, So essentially, people will apply to the UN to seek refugee status. The UN will allocate families, whether it's from the Congo or Somalia or Syria. Essentially, wherever, whatever country sort of gets that little attention on the scroll on the bottom of CNN, will usually find communities that find themselves in that scroll will find themselves their way to the United States. They don't get, these civil wars throughout the world do not get a lot of media attention. However, it is the reality for millions and millions of people. And so when a person applies to become a refugee, they essentially have deemed it unsafe to be able to return to their home. Um, we have, for example, a lot of people from Somalia in our Lancaster community. The civil war in Somalia, I believe, has been going on almost as long as I've been alive, starting in around late 1989 into 1991. So this idea of people being able to return when it is deemed safe, it's never been safe. And so a lot of times what will happen is people will flee their homes into a neighboring country. So a friend of mine and his 8 siblings from Somalia, when they had to flee, they fled to neighboring Kenya, into a refugee camp, where they stayed for 10 years. They were there for 10 years until they were able to get resettled here to the Lancaster area. And so it is a rather complicated system full of interviews and background checks. But the system itself really does rely on the steadfast compassion and resilience of even faith communities within hosting communities to be able to bring them here. They will be the first to acknowledge that this work would probably not be possible without the faith community, throughout the United States, to be able to make this work possible. And so all of that to say, what does 2021 and beyond look like for both CWS, for the Lancaster community, for E-Town Church of the Brethren? It's hard to think about these kinds of things in the midst of a pandemic that has certainly consumed all of our lives over the last year. But within, the headlines that are pandemic related, there have been a lot of major changes that have happened even in the last number of months to the refugee program. And I think it's important for me to say on the outfront that things still change at a slow pace. Things do not happen overnight as much as we would like them to, or as much as we anticipated them to. So every year, the United States um, during the beginning of the fiscal year, in the beginning of October, sets a number goal of how many refugees the United States will resettle um, per year. And for decades, that number was fairly consistent and sort of allowed America to be one of the leaders in refugee resettlement. Um, a few years ago, a lot of those systems were changed, became highly politicized, and those numbers dropped very dramatically, to the point where it was almost zero. Not only the amount of refugees we were allowed to welcome into our community, but where they were from was for the first time put into question. So back in 2015, we would have seen many families from Syria and Somalia and Iraq coming. That has not been the case over the last number of years. So a lot of people have asked, what does this all mean now for the year 2021? Have things been changed? And the answer is that yes, they have been. There have been some significant changes to the system, but like I said, not as quickly as I sort of would have hoped. And I say this without any. I will say this as straight facts, with hopefully no commentary behind it. The fact of the matter is that we at the CWS office were anticipating seeing a very large increase in the amount of refugee arrivals here, even within the spring, due to things that we were promised by the U.S. government, and those things have not yet come to pass. We continue to wait for the administration to sign a piece of paper, I'll just put it that way, in order for us to do the work that we feel called to do. We have had, even in the last month or so, many flights that were booked be canceled. Family from the Congo, a family from Rwanda that were scheduled to come, and their flights had to be canceled because some of those things are still not yet in place, and we do not currently know why these changes have not been made. However, we're told, that they are coming. And so CWS Lancaster is in this interesting space where we feel like we really need to prepare for the future. We're told that we could have the ability to resettle up to 10 times the amount of refugee families that we did even in the last 2 years in the next year. And so, as you can imagine, we're trying to make sure that we have the resources and systems in place to be able to make that happen. And that is where the faith community comes in, because those things are not even remotely possible without the broader faith community being willing and able to work with us to help resettle these families. One of my primary responsibilities in this job is to find small groups of people within primarily churches to work as, the word that a lot of people use is sponsorship, but we've sort of been changing some of the language over the years. And so we use this idea around welcome teams, being able to establish groups of people that are connected within the broader community that can do even some of the work that we don't have the capacity to do. And so we are in this sort of recruiting phase, I guess you could say, which is interesting because I feel this push and pull because, I think we've been told over the last year to not interact with our community, but here I am asking you to interact with your community. And And so I fully acknowledge that this is a really bizarre time to be looking for groups of people who are willing to work with families during their adjustment period, being integrated um, into our community. And one of the other things that I think is very important to note as we look to the future, as we look to, when we were told that we could look to possibly resettling up to 10 times the amount of refugees in the next 12 to 18 months, our first thought is like, well, where are they going? Where are we going to put them? Um, a lot of refugees, as you can imagine, are sort of anchored within Lancaster City. Um, occupancy rates, I think, in Lancaster are about like 98, 99%. There is just very little housing. And so we are actually heavily looking to other communities um, that would be welcoming. Whether that, and Elizabethtown is one of them. We feel like, can Elizabethtown, the town, be a place that would be welcoming to both house, employ, and simply be neighborly to people from around the world? And that's certainly a conversation that I would love to have with churches all throughout the area within E-Town. Um, we got a call the other day. I'm not sure who it was from, but it was from a woman who has, I think, a 4-bedroom apartment in E-Town. And, we're desperately looking for housing almost every single day. And so for someone to just call us up and say they have a 4-bedroom apartment that they are looking to, rent out to, I mean, that's just sort of a God's gift that doesn't happen all that often. And she said, would you be willing to house refugees in Elizabethtown? I'm like, yeah, yeah, that's fine. Because we know that there is the possibility of there being a very welcoming community that could possibly help engage in this work. So the last, sort of the last thing that I will say, one of the things that I have learned over the last number of years, well before I even started at CWS, but one of the things that Lancaster County has taught me over the last few years is always, in whatever I do, in whatever any of us do, to be guided by the faith that we adhere to the person that we are called to follow, and recognizing that this scripture, for example, that we hold so dear, that has guided all of our lives, that is really the common denominator of why we are all here. If we are truly to believe that that scripture has been either inspired or inerrant or what have you, whatever word you want to use, it is a story told through the eyes of people who are displaced, from cover to cover. I think sometimes when we think about, what does our faith call us to do when looking to how we are welcome to the foreigner or the alien or the stranger, we sometimes cherry pick different verses, whether it's through Levitical law or whether it's through Paul's letters. We say like, well, God tells us to do this and that. But I think it's much deeper than that. We sometimes fail to recognize that the lens of scripture is almost exclusively written, not all, but almost exclusively written through the eyes of the displaced. Whether it is wandering through the desert for 40 years, whether it is being in exile in Babylon, whether it's through Paul's eyes as he is being exiled to some remote island off of the coast of Greece. Scripture has been written and is given to us through the centuries, through the eyes of people who try their best to follow God through being displaced, being in seeking refuge. Um, and so I think there's something very important for us to think about when we think about what it is that we are called to do, who it is that we are called to be. Um, it was not by accident that God chose to tell his story through those lenses. Um, I think there is something deeper, and that's why I continue to believe that Scripture is just as relevant today as it was 3,000 years ago. Um, I think, especially in the light of the fact that we have a globalized world that has seen more displaced people than it has ever seen, there is truly something that God is trying to tell us. Um, for the last 10 years, I worked at an organization in little old Salunga. That's a cute town. Um, but I worked for 10 years trying to appeal to people to basically sell everything they have, sell their house, pack up um, all of their belongings, and move to another country to share the gospel. And that's sort of became, yeah, just my bread and butter for almost a decade. Um, and so working with people who were willing to do that, to pull themselves out of their own culture, place themselves into a completely foreign culture where language is unknown. I worked a lot with coaching people on how to do that with respect, dignity, and just to do it well. Now I feel like I'm doing part of the opposite. Um, I'm appealing to the broader faith community that is well within the majority of people within Lancaster County to be willing and open to open their own hearts, minds, and culture to people who are not from this culture. Um, so the dynamics are completely different from what I was advocating for years as to what I'm advocating for now. And so I hope and pray that not just E-Town Church of the Brethren, but many churches in Elizabethtown. I still have to call up E-Town Mennonite, my friends there, to start talking to them. But I really do believe, and hopefully I'm not too naive or too optimistic, that there is a brighter future for both refugee resettlement and how we are going to be able to live out our faith in that work. And so I believe that the legacy of Lancaster is not done. I believe that it is possibly turning a page into a new chapter that hopefully God will continue to write. Whew, excuse me. That's a lot of talking. How are we all doing? We're all still awake and stuff?
I have, there's a couple questions that came into the chat, Andrew, if you don't mind. The first question is, does Church World Service have any involvement with the people trying to cross the U.S.-Mexican border?
Yeah, so Church World Service as a national organization does have significant work. The Lancaster office, the areas in which the Lancaster office specifically, which is far removed from the southern border geographically, is that we do have a legal services department that works with people who are trying to seek asylum, for example, and that includes that can include a lot of, we hear the terms unaccompanied minors coming to the border. So we would have done and continue to do a lot of legal counseling for those who are in, there are 2 immigration detention centers, one in York and one in Berks County. That sometimes people coming across the southern border will get allocated to, I guess you could say. And so we do a lot of advocacy and legal work within those structures. And so, yeah, that is primary, and that's done by people within our office who are professionals in immigration law. And so there are times where that will be part of our work. Now, CWS global or nationwide, I believe has a pretty strong presence at the southern border in terms of relief, for example, making sure that there are relief supplies that are brought down primarily into the areas where kids and families are being detained, providing blankets and clothes and food. And I'll say, even working in the advocacy level as well, making sure that there is a strong vocal presence within positions of power who are able to make various decisions as to how that all plays out. I don't know if that's a...
Yeah, great. Thank you. Another question that's here is, does Church World Service accept partnerships with other charity organizations?
Oh, certainly. Depending on what the joint venture is, I guess you could say. We know that there are things that our office just does not have the capacity to provide, but still are needs. So one of the more pragmatic or practical ways that I see, that I have witnessed CWS partnering with other nonprofits or charity organizations is around like goods and services for our clients. So when we have a refugee family arrive, we have a warehouse that is full of furniture and kitchen supplies and cleaning products, that we try to fill in the apartment that folks are getting resettled. One thing that we do not do, that we don't have the space to do or the capacity to do, is accept clothing. So we contract with various thrift stores, whether that is Salvation Army, Goodwill, MCC thrift stores, what have you, to make sure that our clients are able to find affordable clothing. So yeah, there's all kinds of partnerships with both the nonprofit and the for-profit, whether that's our people who are willing to employ refugee families. That is obviously always a huge need. So yeah, it certainly runs the spectrum.
Another question, when a refugee is in another country and applies to the UN to be resettled somewhere, do they have say in where they end up going to? They don't pick the country that they ultimately land in? How does that work?
So yeah, that certainly depends. From what I've come to learn, and it's probably way more complicated than I'm thinking it is, one of the best ways that a family would have really any say into where they are being resettled is if they already have prior family within a certain geographic area. So, a lot of the cases that were coming across our office in the last number of months have actually been family reunification, we'll call it, where, someone can say like, well, I have, my brother, lives in Columbus, Ohio. That would at least sort of get that family preference possibly. and then they will contact that sibling and, verify that he is the sibling. So that's one of the areas that it probably is the most determinative for where folks can go. But by and large, refugees do not necessarily have much of a say of where they are getting resettled. One of my favorite stories is my friend from Somalia, when he learned that he was going to be resettled in a place called Lancaster, Pennsylvania, in the United States. He did a lot of research into Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and if you want to just try to figure out where, what he could have found, just Google Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and pretend you're from Somalia, and just see what you would think.
There's another question here. I think I'm going to turn it over to Naomi. If you want to go ahead and ask your question.
Sure, yeah. So one of my multiple interests is also in interfaith work and interfaith relationships. So I preface my question by saying that one of the initial kind of questions that brought me into interest in researching refugee welcome and resettlement in Lancaster is the question of motivation. And so one of the facets of that question, and that's probably going to be where my dissertation is hanging. One of the facets of that for me is I'm a lifelong member of the Church of the Brethren, fairly well acquainted with the heritage and theology, but I'm also aware that I think it's evident in this area that there's been, and I will also try to say this as diplomatically as possible, an American evangelical influence into some of the Anabaptist and Pietist traditions that has led to some increased interest in some groups or people for conversion or for, motivation based out of sort of this sense of doing mission work at home. And you were kind of alluding to that a little bit earlier with the whole concept of mission work abroad versus doing mission work. And mission work is broadly and widely and varied understood. So I realize that. Anyway, so my question is kind of twofold. One is, I'm curious, does CWS, particularly in Lancaster, work with ICCL, the Islamic Community Center of Lancaster, or we have a couple Jewish synagogues in the area. I don't think there's any Buddhist or Hindu groups until you get up to Harrisburg. But so is there kind of any interfaith partnerships happening in Lancaster? And then the subtext of that question is, when families come who are not Christian, is there any intent to connect them in with faith groups that are more with which they have more fluency and with which they can connect on a faith-based level? So I guess my concern is both for the religious environment of Lancaster, but also the religious and faith practice of the refugees that are coming that are not Christian.
Okay, all right. Where to start? So the first question, I think we need to get coffee at some point, I think.
And this is why it's a dissertation.
Right. So to address the interfaith question, it probably does not need to be, said, but I'll say it anyway, is just this acknowledgement that in terms of percentage of the populate that is within any religious group, this is a very Christian heavy county. So, which even that is sort of not necessarily fully understood, because I believe research has said about only 25 to 30% of Lancaster County residents claim they attend a church, which would still be a strong minority. But it feels like there is a very strong Christian presence. So when you talk about the work that I do in appealing to broader faith groups, it will automatically feel, from someone who is looking on the outside in, a little skewed when I am interacting with 10 churches and also ICCL. Because there are only 2 mosques in Lancaster. So the areas in which we partner in interfaith work that we certainly, I'll say right off the bat, lean into as much as possible, and embrace and try to foster, it becomes unique for every situation. So just take the Islamic Center as an example. Obviously, we have a lot of, well, we are hoping that over the coming 12 to 18 months, we will see a lot of families coming from Muslim majority countries, which was not the case for the last 3 to 4 years. Obviously, we will rely heavily on ICCL to be able to give them a home. And so they are certainly connected to refugee communities well beyond Church World Service within Lancaster. But, you know, there is someone on ICCL that is on our board of directors that, you know, in terms of financial support we receive from ICCL. And as far as, you know, the Jewish synagogues, I am finding that piece to be so fascinating because a lot of the partnerships that, again, I've only been here for 3 or 4 months. A lot of the partnerships that we've had with some of the synagogues have been these sort of one-off joint ventures. So, for example, I got this, it had to be one of the most adorable emails I have ever received in my entire life. I want to print it and frame it on my wall. It's from this girl named Mazzy, and she wants to have people donate to Church World Service for her bat mitzvah. And I just thought that was great. And so, you know, she said, you know, how can I get my synagogue to learn more about what Church World Service does? Okay, so your second question, that is a loaded one. One of the things that I have been doing in connecting with faith groups is really getting at, and maybe poking the bear a little bit too much, around this idea of motivation. What is it that fuels the desire for people to engage in this kind of work? And I think you can imagine that it runs the gamut. One of the things that I have been, you know, one of the philosophies, I guess you could say, or I'll say missiologies that has been ingrained in my brain over the last decade is this notion around, you know, what interfaith dialogue truly looks like. And what are the motivations behind building relationships with people who are not of your same faith. You know, you are right that there are groups who are highly motivated by, I'll even say, the prospect of potential conversion. One of the things at CWS that we make sure that we articulate very well, as best as we can, within our policies is, you know, we would have this sort of, in terms of volunteers who work with us anyway, a sort of no proselytization policy, mostly because a lot of the people who are fleeing because of religious persecution. Now, that does not mean, and I think people can sort of interpret that in two different ways. One of the things that we've seen, or that I've been told that we've seen, that would not be best practice by any stretch of the imagination is, say, conversion through favor. Or, you know, there would be a welcome team who would say to a family like, oh, you know, I'll buy you this winter coat if you come to this Bible study with me. That's, you know, pretty, yeah. However, one of the things that we cannot control, and I have no intention of controlling, because I would feel that it is inauthentic to who even refugees are as human beings, is to somehow stifle dialogue that naturally or organically occurs between people who are building a relationship. I can't police that. And I don't really want to either, because one of the things that I have learned even in my travels abroad is how open so many other societies are to talking about matters of faith that we are not. You know, when I was in a slum in Nairobi that was mostly made of Somali refugees, the way in which they talked about their faith, it was just constant. Their lens was through their own faith, and so I believe that there is the ability, or maybe I am naive, that there is the ability to have healthy dialogue that is geared towards a mutual peace building, but also at the same time, ingrained within both parties a desire to share one's faith. When you're talking about Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, there is between all, I'm not getting necessarily into Buddhism or Hinduism, but mostly because most of my relationships interfaith are with Muslims. There is a very strong missionary nature within those faiths. And so I think a lot of times what you will get, particularly in dialogue, is, if done with dignity and respect and integrity, one that is not manipulative or coercive, you are able to come to even a mutual understanding that, yes, my Muslim friends will tell me right to my face that their hope is that someday I will become a Muslim. That I've heard that said to me, like, well, yeah, we would love for you to come to the mosque with us. We would love for you to adhere to our faith. They're not shy about it. I think sometimes we get a little bit shy about who it is we are. And I'm recognizing the time, so I know we got to move on, but did I miss questions? I probably did.
No, I think that's good. And we are coming to the close of our time together. So Andrew, I wanted to thank you so much for your willingness to come and share with us this morning. I really appreciate that. We will continue to be connected with Church World Service in any number of ways. So we look forward to the ways in which we'll continue to dialogue with you into the future, and would encourage everyone here who's participating this morning to think about the different ways that you can continue to support Church World Service. So Andrew, thank you so much. And we look forward to our partnership in the future. To everyone, as a reminder, we will not be meeting for Sunday school next week on Easter Sunday. We will be gathering outside at 9 a.m. For a very short service, and we'll still have our 10:30 live stream. So that'll be a unique opportunity. So fingers crossed for great weather. But take care, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you, Andrew. And grace and peace.
All right. Thanks, everyone.